Our first panelist is David Bainbridge. David is an executive leadership partner with over 2 decades of experience across the engineering and resource industries, from frontline management to VP level across 4 continents. He now works one-on-one with senior leaders navigating the hardest transition of their careers, being a high performer to a sustainable leader. We also have Kieran Quinn, CFO of Pacific Health Group, and he brings over 20 years experience across professional services, high growth and private equity businesses. Kieran has operated in complex corporate environments across Europe, the US, Asia, New Zealand and Australia, and he specializes today in building high performing teams and aligning financial strategy with regulatory, commercial and stakeholder priorities. Next, we have Dr. Jemma King. Jemma has her PhD in human behaviour, and she's an emotional intelligence and performance under stress expert. She's a research fellow at the University of Queensland School of Psychology and works as a specialist external advisor on leadership to McKinsey. She's consulted to the Australian Defence Force, Special Operations Command, the Centre for Australian Army Leadership, the Australian Olympic Swim Team, the Australian Government Solicitors, and the Australian Institute of Sport. Finally, we have Rob Shaw, who is the CFO of PWR Holdings. He brings deep global experience across advanced manufacturing, fintech, and multi-brand food retail and franchising. He's known for his disciplined approach to capital allocation and his ability to build high-performing, commercially focused teams. Moreover, he is passionate about scaling high-growth businesses. So we're really joined today by a strong group of professionals to speak on our topic. So to start us off, Kieran, thinking about our audience today, I think everyone will benefit from hearing what early leadership lesson has stayed with you and still influences how you work today.
Hi, everyone. My story kind of goes back to when I was working at a professional services firm, and at times we were working long hours on different projects. I could leave the office at 9 o'clock at night, full of energy, and all of a sudden I ended up in a leadership role, and I was getting to 5 p.m. absolutely exhausted. We were spending the day kind of jumping potentially at times every 30 minutes from one topic to another, and I was feeling really drained. And I think one of the biggest lessons for me was, how do I get the balance right, and really take control of my diary? So I guess I often talk about the analogy that Stephen Covey gives in his time management clip on YouTube, when he talks about kind of how you fill the jar with the rocks and then you add in the sand and the water and kind of how you fit the time around it. But when I think about my diary every week, that's effectively the critical control mechanism that I've got for how I'm going to operate and how I need to respond to the challenge of the week. And I normally start with the family stuff. So what's the school assembly, or picking up the kids, or some of the things that you can't drop. Then maybe if I'm lucky, I'll switch to thinking about when I'm going to fit in a date night or some time with my wife. And then I get on to the me time stuff and think about, what am I going to do for me during the week to keep me sustainable as I go through it? So that could be, if I'm traveling, I'm thinking about, well, when am I going to fit in some exercise, or how am I going to fit in some time to get out for a run or a bike ride or some time with friends? And then what are the critical kind of work deadlines of the week? And if I get those rocks nailed in my diary, then at least I know that if I just achieve that in the week, I'll have ticked off kind of all of the important things. And then after that, I start to turn my attention to, what does my team need? Where do I need to kind of add in strategic time that I want to intentionally put into areas? And I generally have my diary pretty much fully booked a week or two in advance, where I know that I've got control over it. And my biggest fear is probably having other people find gaps in my diary and put things into it that I don't necessarily want to be in or want to be in control of. So I think having that control mechanism for me was really critical. And I found that was that shift between getting to 5 o'clock really exhausted, and instead thinking about, actually, where do I need to put energy, and being able to come home and have energy to spend with the kids or the family, and not just be jaded from the day.
Yeah, fantastic. And Dr. King, same question to you. What early leadership lesson has stayed with you and still influences how you work today?
I think it's really important to understand that leadership is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You really want to be in the game for a long period of time. And the leaders who I've seen do that really effectively really look at self-leadership first. So in order to lead others, you must first be able to lead yourself. Your physiology, learning what your mental dialogue, how you interact with others then follows. But, leading yourself means looking at things like, are you emotionally regulated? Are you sleeping? Are you exercising? What has been said before? Are you eating well? And then think about, why would someone want to follow you, listen to you, do as you say, look up to you if you haven't got your act together? And people think, oh, people don't notice, but actually people do notice. When you don't have your act together, when you're sleep deprived, when you're stressed out, you produce, chemicals, you produce cortisol that other people subconsciously pick up, and they just get this feeling about you like, maybe this is not the person for me to lead or to listen to. So yeah, self-leadership is the biggest one.
Yeah, great. And David, was there a moment in your career when you realised that perhaps being a top performer and being an effective leader were not the same thing?
Yeah, I think it's when you look at what you classify as success and what you classify as high performance. When you're coming through the business, you tend to be focused on certain metrics and measures that then, when you succeed in those spaces, it's considered high performance. And there's a real risk as you step out of that sort of operationally focused roles, metric-driven roles into leadership roles. You tend to cling on to that identity. And so there's a point where you're really, really good at something and it becomes a little bit of your identity. And when you move into leadership roles, you often will take on other remits that aren't your specialty and aren't your skill set. So you might be an extremely high performer in one element of the business, and it's been the key to your success. And then when you step into leadership roles, you naturally get a broader remit. So by that method, you can't be an expert in those other things. You can't be a high performer. A great example is if you're a finance director and you know all things numbers and you aspire to be a CFO one day, then as a CFO, you're going to have governance remits and future financing remits. And they're going to be things that you may not get exposure to. So thinking that you can maintain your high performance in those operational metric-driven things, I think is a mistake as you move into those leadership roles. So you kind of have to let go of that identity.
Yeah, fantastic. And Rob, following on from David's comments, you are a CFO. How did your leadership style change over time as your responsibilities grew?
Yeah, it's definitely changed over time because I've definitely made a lot of mistakes along the pathway as well. I mean, I think to sort of echo David's points, I started off as a high performer and I took that into my leadership style when I first became sort of manager and a leader of people. I didn't have a great deal of training. Yes, you went through, some role plays and some different bits and pieces, but it never really resonated with me. It didn't feel authentic to what I wanted to be as a leader. And so, I was coming from a situation where I was the high performer. You had the high quality work standards that you were trying to achieve in everything you put out, whether that was financial statements or as a reconciliation or as a project that you're working on. And so you take that into the way you manage the team, and that almost becomes your expectations of them. And then if they're not, people aren't meeting it, you're trying to say, well, okay, I'm going to fill the gap because it's got to get to this standard and it's got to be done in this way. And that increases the pressure on, or I initially for me, it increased the pressure on me to sort of fill the gap because I also wasn't having the hard conversations with the team to say, this is the standard we've got to get to, and this is what we're trying to achieve, and this is the deadline. I'd try and fill the gaps in that without sort of leading on the team. And I think for me, it changed. I was almost taking the pressure off the team. I sort of had to adapt my style to sort of say, well, how do I get the most out of the team that I've got working for me? Because that's going to get the biggest benefit to the employer and to the role that I'm trying to perform. And so for me, it's learning to have those conversations with people was a really important piece for me. But then also understanding the goals of the company and what we're trying to achieve and matching my leadership style to the company and where we're going to at that moment in time.
So you would describe sustainable leadership as having conversations with the team and matching it to the organizational priorities. Is there anything else for you that would be sustainable leadership?
I think it's, for me, it's a combination of the sustainable leadership and the sort of situational side of it being that you're looking at the longer term goals of where you're trying to get to. That does mean sometimes it won't be perfect, but it does mean that you understand that you're leaving the organization in a better place than when you found it, and you're trying to get the most out of the team without and sort of balance their priorities and balance their work efforts so that you're not burning people out, trying to achieve the impossible. I do think, you've really got to try and think about there are periods of time that's going to be really tough. Like finance in particular has, you have a month end, or you have a year end, you have a reporting period, you have a project. That doesn't mean it has to, that's not necessarily a long-term thing. And so you can have to get through a crunch point of a project, and you're still looking at the long term. You can't maintain that pace forever.
And you've touched on it a little bit around feeling as a leader that you need to bridge this gap between maybe the ability of the team and where the expectations are. Many of the middle managers on this call are promoted because they are outstanding individual contributors first. So why else do you think that transition becomes difficult?
For me, I think it was I didn't change, or perhaps I just expected everybody would get to the exact same way that I would do it, or to the same standard that I wanted to be done to. And I would try and be across everything, which was always a challenge, because you're used to being across your entire remit because you could be. Because if you're a high performer, you have your job, let's say that's 40 hours, and you're probably also putting in extra hours as well, and it comes together and you can cover a lot of ground and you can get into the nitty-gritty. But then you get a team and you might go from 5 or 10 people, and suddenly you're covering off areas that you're potentially not the specialist in, but you've also got a much bigger remit that just, one person can't be across all those balls in the air, and you probably shouldn't be, like you're not going to have those people develop and take ownership of them if you're trying to be across every aspect of what they're doing as well.
Yeah, brilliant. And Kieran, I'd be interested in your opinion here. Do you have an idea of why you think that transition can also become difficult?
I think it's a real case of kind of what got you to that point isn't kind of what you need from then on. So it's quite a reset in terms of kind of how people need to operate. And, to the analogy you gave, Rob, when somebody's working kind of in a task-oriented role, they can control many aspects of that. So it's easy to go, if we need to achieve this by a certain date, it's all on them to get to that deadline. Whereas all of a sudden, as a manager, you become dependent on multiple different people to feed into that process. You've got to juggle all the other things that come along with that as well. When all of a sudden, 1 or 2 members of the team phone in sick, and then you're trying to rejuggle everything that needs to happen and still hit that deadline. And the mindset people come from is it used to be all within their control. So they double down, they add extra hours, and they end up going, how can I try and put myself in a position to solve for this? But I think there's an element of when we start thinking about sustainable leadership, you've got to find a way to go, how do you do this in a balanced way? How do you think about the resources you've got at hand and what you can control in that kind of bigger sense? And maybe there's things you need to slow down and speed up in order to make it those deadlines. But I think ultimately it's about thinking about what needs to be achieved. How do you delegate and trust others to bring those things together? And then one of the things I've found really successful is designing all of the controls that need to be in place in order to ensure that we don't drop the balls on different things. So for me, I've got some monthly reports that I get, and I know that if the metrics are right in those reports, I know that everything is working kind of behind the scenes in the way it should. And it's thinking through, how often do you need to be across that? Is for some things it could be daily or weekly, and then for other things you can say, hey, I don't need to worry about that. I can check it once a month. And once I know that that's on track, the system's working, everybody's playing their part in the team, and we're finding a way effectively to lead in a sustainable way in that sense.
So it sounds like great leadership has learned. It's not something that happens overnight and not assumed, and the leaders who acknowledge that seem to tend to be the most effective ones. And I think one of the most defining moments in any leadership career is the shift from being, as you said, right, the person who gets things done to the person who enables, as Rob was saying, to allow other people to get things done as well. And so for most middle managers, that's probably rarely as straightforward as it sounds, as we've started to talk about. And we talk a lot about, okay, well, what makes a great leader, but less often about what you need to let go of to become one. So, Kieran, I'd love to keep speaking with you about what that shift actually looks like in practice. And then later we'll build on some of those insights into how sleep and burnout and recovery all connect, and obviously what that means for performing at your best over the long term. So, Kieran, what are the most common signs that someone is still operating like a top performer rather than leading like a manager?
I think this is a really good segue to what we've just been talking about, in the sense that often when I see somebody that's taking it all on themselves and that they're the ones that are heavily in the doing roles rather than in the leading roles, it probably feels like they're still striving for that top quality output they've always been able to deliver, rather than bringing the team on the journey with them. And I think for me, I was quite lucky where I had a number of projects and a team around me that I could help bring into those projects from a young stage in my leadership journey. And I very quickly learned the benefit of that, where potentially somebody may not have been up to the level where you think, hey, this person could add a lot of value to this project. But by bringing them in early to it, that opportunity and the time that I gave those people to help give them a chance to be able to learn, do something a little bit different maybe from what they were otherwise doing in the week, and get involved in a project. It gave me somebody then over time that was building a skill that became really useful in the team. And I used that as a way to kind of broaden kind of how I thought about delegating, where I'm constantly thinking about each time we're getting a task going, who's this a good opportunity for? Both in my team, but also at lower levels in the team, where potentially they can feed into that and it becomes a learning. And it also gives them an opportunity to stretch and to grow as well in their roles. But it also means there's more people that are across these things, because fundamentally for me, I don't want to be the cog in the wheel in any of these processes. I want to have a supported team around me that actually, many different people can pick things up, and it gives them a broader grasp of things that are evolving and changing in the business as well.
And that can be hard, I think, from personal experience, when you are a top performer, when you have to let go of doing something that you do very well, and it's got you to the place where you are today, and then start leading through others instead. What would you say is probably some of the hardest things about that?
Definitely think it's a big mindset shift. So I think you need to lean into that, and it's something that you need to do consciously if it's not coming naturally to you. But I also think you need to focus on outcomes rather than processes, because I think sometimes people have a certain way or a certain style of how they've done things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only way to get there. And what I found myself doing initially was taking kind of partially completed work, and I was going, oh, I wouldn't have written that way, or I wouldn't have done that this way, or I like to see the logic that I'd always followed to make sure that I got to the end. And instead of focusing on that, I was more focusing on, well, what are the sense checks and what are the things that I can put over where we've got to with these processes, so that I can make sure we've got the safeguards, that it's still, getting to the right position in the end. But with that outcome focus, it allowed the team more room for growth themselves, and it gave them more of an opportunity where I didn't need to necessarily spoon feed every step along the way. I could give them more and more opportunities themselves to step up and actually take more leadership on the journey that we were going on for whatever that project was.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I think, really good leaders encourage you to delegate. And sometimes that can be tough for us because it means that we have to unlearn bad habits. So what would you say one leadership habit you've had to unlearn to become more effective actually is?
I think for me, initially, I wanted to be the leader that was always available. So I wanted to be that person that people could tap into all the time. And going back to kind of where I started the conversation around balance and control of diaries, what I quickly learned was that was going to be great for somebody else, but it was going to be terrible for me. And I was going to end up with no control over my time or my diary as a consequence. So for me, how I shifted was thinking about, when I'm working with teams, I try to be upfront around how we're going to connect and how I find the balance of availability for what they need to deal with the urgency or the importance of the situation that they're working through, or just with general times when we'll catch up, and try and focus a lot of what they need into those meetings or into those conversations. And often what that prevents is a lot of emails coming to me for ad hoc questions or for things to kind of review piecemeal, where I don't necessarily have the ability to quickly respond to those, or things like interruptions where I'm trying to get into something else and then somebody's trying to pull you out of that to try and help with what's going on. So getting that balance right between being available and supporting the teams is definitely something that's worth thinking about.
And I think it's a really important piece to mention as well, because balance can be difficult, especially when leaders want to do a good job and they want to succeed. And, perhaps they even see that they're, if they see a clear career growth trajectory, maybe balance is something that they would consider putting maybe in the back seat in order to get there. So I think it's really important that you mention balance. Is there anything aside from the balance that for you is sustainable leadership in practice?
I think for me personally, it's thinking about the state of flow. So that idea of how do you feel like within the day that you were able to balance your energy with the needs of different things that are going on while still being present in each conversation and finding the time to give to the task at hand. So often in a longer term sense, it feels like that sense of flow gives great satisfaction to me that we're in control. We've got the right resources allocated to the right things, but it also gives the team a sense of confidence that they've got a great idea of where we're going, what's the next important thing that's coming up, where do they need to be putting their priorities and energy into as well. And that allows the whole system kind of within our kind of wider team to operate in a really sustainable way across many people that are involved in it.
Yeah, and I love that you are also considering your team's career growth as well, because I think that could be something that many leaders potentially forget about because they're so focused on doing the activities that sometimes it can be. You need to remind people that there also are people underneath you that are ready for that career progression, or, there's additional duties. What would you say would be the best way to start having some of those conversations with your team if our leaders on the call here can see the ability to be able to do that?
I think there's two parts to that. I think sometimes you need to test people and they may not necessarily appear ready, but there might be an element of how do you allow them opportunities for growth that they may not necessarily think they're ready for, because sometimes that capability is within someone that you can unlock rather than something that's really obvious. But we just have conversations about it as a team. So I often get the challenge back from my team going, how are we going to resource for this? Or, what's the next priorities and how do we think about kind of where they should be putting their time next? And as part of that, we're consciously having a people conversation to think about who else is in their teams, what are they thinking about, and how are they bringing those people on a growth journey? Because ultimately, I feel like that drives more satisfaction for the teams in their own work that they do on a day-to-day basis, but also showing that as an organization, we're thinking about how we can continue to support them to grow. We're fortunate in our organization where it's loaded with opportunity. There's many projects. There's always different things on the go. So there's always opportunities like this, but it's just trying to find the right balance rather than going to the same group of people or some of those managers in turn taking it on themselves and trying to do too much. It's a great opportunity as part of their own growth on their journey to think about who else they can bring along. And I think it makes the team feel really supported, but it's also about knowing where strengths sit within the team. And if you can create a way to be able to balance how that comes about, I think it shares the load quite a lot around the team and it makes it more sustainable for everybody.
Yeah, fantastic, Kieran. Thank you. And Rob, interested to hear from you. What does sustainable leadership look like in practice, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's really trying to fit the balance. I mean, the companies that I've been fortunate to work for have often been very fast growth, relatively small companies, but very fast growth. And so they don't necessarily have always the size of team that you'd love to have in place at all times. And so partly it's about trying to get through a certain project or a certain period of time. Whilst again, you're sort of looking at the longer term goal of where you're going, but also trying to balance that flavour of what the team needs to get from A to B. And so, sort of building on Kieran's point, a lot of people have joined the companies and the teams that I've managed for that experience, and so they're getting the opportunity to be across an ASX listed company. They might get involvement in investor relations, they might get involvement in debt renegotiations or capital raise or M&A, whatever it is. They've joined for that. And so, to Kieran's point, like, part of their development is trying to give them those opportunities that if they were working for a large bank, they might not have those same breadth of role, which is what they're doing for in their career. And so that's good, because it does give you opportunity to sort of give them that experience, and to some degree people put in the extra effort because they can see the goal, especially the high performance. They can see where they want to go. Part of the sustainability aspect is trying to not burn out the same people all the time, to spread the load, to work out when you do need to put additional resources in, and sort of trying to find a balance in that, which is really tough.
Yeah, of course. And I guess to speak about you a little bit more personally, Rob, was there a point in your career where you felt maybe you were relying too much on personal effort or long hours, or to what yourself and Kieran have mentioned so far, being kind of that go-to problem solver? What changed?
Definitely was that case, and it was somewhat in the middle of my career. Actually, it was probably a decade ago now, but I was CFO of a listed company. We're on the cusp of the ASX 200, and we're just doing a transformative acquisition that was really, really big for the company at its size at the time. It was $500 million. It was international, so we were going through due diligence. We were doing capital raise, we were doing debt raise, looking after investor relations, and so there were 1,000 moving parts. And whilst it was great, for the company and for me, I suppose, because I was kind of at the centre of it, I also realised at one point I was nearly broken, nearly asleep on the floor of the office, and it was, gone way too far in terms of that personal effort to try and get it over the line. That was a short-term crunch at the end, need to kind of get to the outcome, because the company was doing something way bigger than it was resourced to do in that period of time. So I think you can go through periods where you have 6 to 8 weeks where you're going into the red zone. What changed was sort of through that process, working out, talking to the team, and conversations about how we were dividing the work up, what people wanted to do, why people were even at EML, and why people were there, and what people were looking to get out of it in terms of the ASX investor experience. Yeah. That was one element. And the second element was the standard test of going back and saying, do I actually need to do this? Is this important, and is this urgent, and does it need to be done now? And working out what you can deprioritise and what you really don't need to be across. Because, when in that situation, I think because I was across so many different elements, I was getting dragged into lots of other people's problems. And so there's an art of saying no as well, and forcing people to actually come up with their own answers, and prioritising what's really important, and making that conscious decision where to say no.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a really important point for a lot of our leaders on the call today, is it's important to be able to say no and delegate to other people, especially in an instance where, Rob, like you've mentioned, for the business, we're going through a really important time of change. And so for a lot of individuals working for the company at the time, right, it's kind of all hands on deck, but knowing that there are still opportunities even within such a big change to be able to take a step back and reevaluate what's important and what's maybe not as urgent like we think it could be today. If we talk about shifting from individual contributor now to leader, Rob, what does it mean to move from being the person with the answers to being the person who enables others to succeed? And I know you've touched on it briefly, but if we could dig into it a little bit more, how do we enable others to succeed?
Yeah, I think first thing for me is you've got to make time for it. And there's a conscious kind of thought pattern for me, which is sort of reminding myself and people who work for me is to think about the size of the team and think about the hours you've got available as a sort of pool of hours. You know, if you've got a team of 10 people and they're doing 40 hours a week, you've got 400 hours. How do you get the best value out of that 400 hours is more important than how you get value out of your 40 hours. And so that's kind of where I kind of start from, is where I'm going to make the best bang for my buck. And where should I be prioritizing? And so I do think high performers sometimes struggle to delegate because, you know, they've been a high performer and they know what the standard is and they know what they want to look like, and they know they have a vision in their mind, like Kieran was talking about earlier, like it should be done this way. You know, with high standards. You know, accountants as well don't really like having difficult conversations. You know, as a sort of a pool of people, you know, that's tough as a personality type. And so I think it's trying to be really conscious about that need to think about management and leadership and how you're going to get the best outcome versus sort of thinking too much about the individual goal and steps A, B, C, D to get from here to here. You know, and you've really got to make a conscious effort, and you've got to allow time for it. You know, you can't do it on the side. Like, it should be part of that core allocation of your hours of how you manage your diary, like Kieran was saying. Like, you've got to put time aside for it in terms of team management. You can't just go in and say, well, I'm going to try and smash through all this work, and then like Friday at 5 p.m. I'll start thinking about the team, or I'll do it on Saturday. You know, like it's got to be it's a core part of your role that you've got to allow time for.
And so what would your advice be when you know something is done well a certain way? And, you know, we've got experiences of this in our organization where, you know, we've got top performers that have done something one way so well that they almost push their teams into doing it that same way, when the reality is there are probably plenty of ways to skin a cat. So what advice would you give to middle managers in trying to help them to see that there are other ways of doing things?
Yeah, I mean, the way I try to typically do it, like if you're thinking about a project that we're putting in a new financial reporting solution at the moment, which will help us finalise our external statutory accounts. You know, it's thinking actively about how you want to be involved in the project, allocating roles in the project, being clear on the expectations and the responsibilities and the kind of the outcomes from the project, and sort of overtly saying them versus taking it as an expectation that somebody should understand what it has to look like, because you in your head, you can see it. Like actually actively sort of talk about that with the team. Agree a schedule when the check-ins are going to be. And so, you know, typically for this kind of project, I like to be involved at the beginning, understand what we're going to do, how we're going to go about it, how we're going to organise it, what the reporting frequency is going to be, and then drop in at various key milestones, and then you're trying to review it towards the end. So you're not trying to be actively involved in every single meeting that might happen, because you'll burn yourself out. And so I think for me, it's that kind of actively don't leave it unsaid, and assume that the person who's working for you knows what your expectations are. You've actually got to talk about it and book it.
And that's, I think, probably where people struggle is it's letting go without feeling like the standards are being lowered, and having that trust in the people that you've hired to do the job that you've hired them to do. Again, advice on perhaps more for the newer middle managers on this call, that letting go piece, knowing that you made a really good point, you can jump back in at the end. Anything that you've had to say to yourself, or just personal ways of managing that desire to even perhaps micromanage, right?
Yeah, I think it very much is a situational need for what is happening in the business. And so typically I work for, you know, listed companies, but they're smaller companies, you know, around the PWR. This year's consensus, $170 million. We've got 650 people around the world, relatively small. And so there's a breadth that people have to kind of cover in their roles. We don't have too many specialists in financial reporting or in IT, for example. So it's kind of that discussion with them about what is key for their career and what, I was talking about before, why are they here versus somewhere else? And that often yields some sort of great, nuggets of information that you can use in terms of their discussions with them about. I'm really interested in getting experience in doing investor relations, disclosures and all the rest of it. And that, if they're super interested in it, it makes that delegation of that task much easier. But you also know where weak spots are, where they want to be developing. And so it's those. Understanding your team is kind of a key piece. Being really intentional about how you're delegating and what you're delegating and what you're doing and what you're not doing. Being clear on times and milestones and check-ins and how you're going to engage with each other. And really thinking about what's strategically necessary. What do you have to do? Not the stuff that just chews up your time. Like you often see people in sort of some of the middle management roles where they get stuck in the continuously approving payments because they've always done it. Like, why are you doing that? Like, how can you can save hours of your life from just being distracted on the stuff that's not adding value?
Yeah. And you spoke about the red zone, which I want to touch on for a second, because I think many of the managers on this call can relate to that intense period where it's a time of change and it does feel like it could maybe extend for a long period of time. And so you mentioned the crunch being something that may actually be necessary for a period, but what's the line between stepping up in that small crunch period and then normalizing on sustainability?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's not one that it will very much vary on the project. A year end is a project, and so my finance team, they know that going into year end, it's not very pleasant to get a full external audit of a listed company. As many people on the call will know, like, it's hard work, it's very pressured for 6 to 8 weeks, but it's it's a known period of time. We know that it was, hopefully starts early June. We go through really hard yards till the end of July, and then we're kind of polishing it up to get it released to market in mid-August. So it's 6 to 8 weeks time period. We know what the milestones are. We've got to get KPMG across these things. We've got tax to do, etc. And it's absolutely necessary because it's a fundamental issue of being a listed company in the ASX. So that, to me, is where it's sort of stepping up into a project and you're running hard for that 6 to 8 week period. If it's open-ended and it's the day-to-day, we just can't get reconciliations. We can't get month-end done on time. We can't get reconciliations done. We're struggling to get accounts payable or accounts receivable processed. Then that's kind of that ongoing challenge. That's a different challenge. Then you've got to really question, is this because we don't have the right number of people? We don't have enough resources in this? Or we're not running ourselves efficiently? We're not structured correctly? Do we not have the right tools? What are we going to change? Because we can't run at this forever. Like, it's like, I'm into cycling. Sadly, I'm not very good at it. But, you can go into the red zone and you can take yourself up into a higher heart rate zone for a period of time, but you can't stay there or you'll fall off.
Yeah. So if you could tell the middle managers on this call to stop one thing that they do today to lead more sustainably, what would that be for you?
I'll go with prioritization and, really being focused across what you need to be, what's important and urgent, not every detail in every spreadsheet. Because if you want to grow as a leader and manager in the business and you want to take on broader responsibilities, that will really quickly become an unsustainable list of things that you can't stay on top of. So you really have to be able to prioritize down to the absolutely clear things that you need to be involved with, and sort of really judge yourself by how well the team runs versus how much output you're individually contributing to it.
Yeah, fantastic. And David, you have a really unique perspective on this because you've moved from those C-suite roles now into some of that leadership development. Can you talk about a moment for you where the pressure of those competing priorities made you rethink how you're actually leading?
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging part of your career, actually. So for the people on the call, I guess it kind of sucks to be in middle management. It's easier when you're sort of part of the operation and you know where you're going, and it's sort of in some ways easier when you're an executive, because you've got this sort of separation. And I think, my experience has been both my own experience and, all the people that I've seen through their careers. It's kind of a swamp as you're sort of trying to work your way through middle management. You've got sort of one foot in the serious operations, as Rob said. If you're in that part of the business, then your tasks of the week, other than things like month end and year end, are pretty much rinse and repeat. So you've got good control over your tasks, you've got good control over your remit, you get an invoice, you approve the invoice as a standard process. You sit within the process and systems of the business. When you're an executive, you don't do any of that stuff. So there's this quite big gap. So that's kind of good when you're at the top and when you're at the bottom, but that middle ground is really difficult because you're kind of left to figure it out by yourself. Everyone who's an executive forgets what it was like, and everyone who is in operations doesn't imagine how horrible it's going to be when you get there. So everyone wants to be there, and then when they're there, they're having a hard time. I think probably Rob and Kieran we've all sort of walked through that point where you're like, this kind of sucks, this bit. And I think that's where you realise that you probably, if you're a high performer, you're already at capacity. So whatever you're doing, you're great, and you're going to be promoted because you are great. So let's assume that everyone on this call is great or potentially is great. And then someone says, hey, how would you love to do this? And you say, of course I would. And as Kieran said, the risk then is that your jar of stones and rocks and sand and stuff is already full, like from your previous career and role. And you're already a high performer. So you're probably already, as Rob said, pushing into the red zone quite often. And you're getting noticed and people think it's great and you think it's great. And someone says, would you love to do this? And you say, sure. And you kind of just take it on board. And you take it on board when, A, you haven't done the work that Kieran said, where you haven't really fundamentally rethought how you add value, how your week's going to look. You sort of go like, I'll do that in my spare time. And so you might be part of a team and then you might be asked to lead the team. And I think the real risk that I see a lot of middle management make is they just say yes and they just try to cram it all in around the stuff they're already doing. And I think, as Kieran said, the reality is what you should do is tip the whole lot out again and start over. And then know, as Rob was saying, well, what is the really important stuff? What's the stuff that I specifically add value doing? And you have to fundamentally rethink it because people on the business is asking you to add value in a different way from how you added value before. So if you've got your jar of rocks and sand and stuff stacked up as you were the high performer in your previous role, whatever it is, wherever, and middle management is a wide space from sort of moving from individual contributor to being, you could have a team of 20, 30, 50 or whatever. You could still be in middle management, still really operationally responsible. And so if you don't take that time to sort of reset all the expectations, reprioritize your week, as both Rob and Kieran said, it's the fact that, or they didn't say this, but the reality is that you're also getting older, life's probably getting busier. You slept on the floor of your office a few times, which I've done as well. That's not very fun when you're in your 40s to be sleeping on the floor in your office. Cool in your 20s, not cool in your 40s, and the 30s is the swamp. So I think that's the idea, that there's this intentionality. And the other thing I think is that no one's going to do it for you. And that's the bit where a lot of people struggle, is they sort of get the promotion, they get the responsibility, they get the title, and then they probably have to figure it out by themselves. And the first solution is always go harder, especially if you're sort of in that hard charging part of your career. That's been the recipe for success. Go harder, work longer, do a Saturday. The problem with that, obviously, is that, and not knowing exactly the demographic of the people on the call, is that can also hit at exactly the same time that life is getting very, very busy for everyone. Like your personal life is getting very busy as well, potentially. So, so you can really sort of be at the rev limit already, and then someone says, do you want a promotion? And of course, that's what you think is success. And you say yes, and you just try and kill it with effort. And I think that's where people really start to be running the risk of burnout. Their performance does drop. Even if they were great performers before, they run the risk of doing a poor job of that and doing a poor job of leading. And so they go from being a great performer to actually be someone who's kind of disappointing the expectations that everyone has set for them. So I think that's really the challenge there.
And I think you've explained it so well, especially when you start to talk about burnout and burning out while leading. What are the warning signs of burnout?
There's actually a lot. I think as leaders, I'm sure Gemma's going to talk a lot about this soon, so I won't pretend I know anything in this space. But the reality is that you've got this duality of watching yourself for burnout and watching your team. And that's what Rob pointed to too. Like sometimes as a middle manager, you do have a team, and now you're responsible for leading yourself, which I know Gemma is very big on. And you've got kind of a responsibility for leading whoever's been put in your team. Might only be 2 people, but probably scale over time. And you may not be very good at delegating. So, you put quite onerous requirements on them, as Kieran also said, like, I want you to do 50 things to get this outcome. I want you to do it the way I do it, and blah, 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 blah. And so you put this onus on people to do stuff in a way that maybe you want it done versus the outcome you want to happen. And because you do that, it tends to be your own strangeness that then you want to be highly involved in it too. So not only do I want to do it my way, I also want to be part of it all. And so you kill your team off and you kill yourself because you've got this extra stuff you should really be doing. You should be focusing on leadership. You should be giving you and the team a longer horizon. Maybe you shouldn't just be thinking about month end. Maybe you should be thinking about year end. But you need space to do that. So you really need to be delegating well. And if you delegate poorly, you weigh the team down, but you also continually are involved in it. And when we talk about burnout, I think there's sort of 2 things to think about. One is you've got sheer effort, exhaustion, fatigue, right? Like I do 56 hours a week, I don't sleep well, blah, 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 blah. And then there's this other piece, which again, probably is really something that Gemma would be great to talk about, is that there's a real emotional burden too. You go from looking after yourself and worrying about yourself and how you feel, and now you've got other people's well-being to look after. So, the type of burnout that you can experience is kind of twofold. It's like this classic fatigue, what people think of burnout, and there's this stress, psychological, physiological fatigue that comes in because now you have other people's tasks to worry about. You have stuff that you're not really in control of. Both Rob and Kieran talked about it. That locus of control that people had when they were high performers is that accountability for the stuff they do and the stuff they deliver. And the types of people we're talking about, whether they're engineers like me or whether they're accountants, there's this real locus of control. And so when things start to get out of their control, but they're still accountable for them, that creates stress, and that can create a different type of fatigue that they may not have much experience in dealing with. And they don't have the tools and techniques to mitigate those sort of risks. So I think burnout is sort of 2 things, both traditional fatigue and emotional psychological fatigue.
And in your experience advising leaders, where do you think then that the leaders get stuck, right, between that top performer to sustainable leader? I know that you mentioned delegation being a big thing. Would you say this is what you most often see as almost that crux of where they fall short? Or in your experience, what do you see?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting transition because some of it is real and some of it's not. Some of it's perception, and as we know, perception is reality. So it seems real for the leader, but for an external party like myself and the other people who are very senior in their roles here on the call, is that you can make real problems. You bake yourself into the process. You delegate poorly. You get everything to come back to you. As Rob said, I want to see every transaction. I want to sign everything off. And you're like, cool, I'm approving $50 bloody things when I shouldn't be. And that's real because now you've like baked yourself into it, right? So now there's this genuine, you've kind of messed it up, right? You've done a poor job of delegating. You've baked yourself into the process. You've got your finger in every pie. And so I think that's real. People say, I have to do this. And you go, well, yeah, that's because you decided you had to do that. So that's a poor process systems delegation issue. Then there's the other weirdness, which is like it kind of has to be my way. I add value by tweaking things. Classically, it's the people who are never happy with the final draft. right? The thing comes across their desk, and whether it's a proposal or whether it's a report or whatever the case may be, they sort of feel like they have to get involved. And as Rob was saying, figuring that out at the beginning where you're like, I really never want to be part of that thing. I trust you. You're great. I'll help you a little bit, but you've got it. And then they move on. That genuinely, they're fine. You've trusted them. You've given them the role. And now it's up to you just to not get re-involved. And I often find that people might even do all the good delegation stuff, but just can't help themselves. Oh, can you just send it to me? I'll have a quick review. And the quick review turns into being like a half a day markup, and then it sends the whole team out to do stuff again next week. And I can see Kieran smiling there. And yeah, it's like it's 95% right, but I want to just fiddle with it. And when you're a high performer, you have that high standard of 95 is not good enough. And so you impose this on people. And so that's sort of the leader's weirdness, right? You kind of end up there and you need to let people do what they do, and you need to be more focused on good outcomes. Rob said something that I just want to echo, is that the way I like to think about things is there's the why, there's the what, and the how. The more senior you get, the more why you have to be worried about, the more what, the less of the how. And so if you get stuck in the, I care more about how you do it than what it achieves, you've kind of messed it up. And so I think that's where I see people stuck in that transition. They both bake themselves into the process for real, but also even if they have done a good job of delegating, they just can't help themselves to just have a little bit of a tweak, a little bit of a help, mess everything up for everyone. So that's what I see a lot of people do.
So then, I'm sure a lot of the leaders on the call would probably think that they're effective right now, right? And so what patterns do you see that where leaders are effective today in the short term, but then it becomes unsustainable in the long term?
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. So what I often see, and what I think businesses see, is you take a high performer and you put them into a more senior role, and you get this temporary uplift in performance through discretionary effort and innate knowledge. So if you're a high performer and you're inside a department or you're inside the operation, you have this organizational knowledge that you know how things work, you know where to get that thing from, and you know what could be done better. And so with that, you use that as the thing that gives the improvement. Behind all that is a bunch of individual effort and also the reliance on you to do it. So imagine I speak a lot about engineering. So imagine you're in engineering and you've got all these great ideas about how things can change. And if I had the magic wand, I would do that. And so you have those, and you now have the power to make those changes. But often they're changes that you make and you execute and you own. So you see the organization has an uptick. Manufacturing gets a little bit better, efficiency gets a little bit better, whatever it may be. Sometimes even retention gets a bit better because now the people who like you tend to have a good reason to stay because I like this bloke and now he runs the show and I'm going to stay, right? So you get all these little upticks. And so sometimes middle management or more junior leaders, they step up and it looks like they're doing a really good job because the metrics and the systems and everything looks pretty good, but it's super unsustainable because remember, that's not their job anymore. Mm-hmm. So now they're kind of doubling down on all that stuff and they're neglecting the long horizon things. So the uptick in performance is short term, unsustainable, and generally you're sacrificing the future performance to achieve it. So that's where I really see this idea that it looks good for that quarter, that end of financial year or whatever. But if you were to trend it over the 1, 3, and 5 years, you're likely that the people who should be paying attention to those things are not because they're so interested in being involved in today's performance.
Totally. And from what you guys have said, right, that then leads to burnout, stress, etc. And I think those things, right, burnout, stress, pressure, are what most leaders would probably innately recognize, but far fewer of them actually know how to manage it in themselves. And so while we all know sustainable leadership starts with looking after yourself, like you said, and actually doing that in practice, is probably the different story. So moving on to our next part of the conversation is really about unpacking, okay, what is constant pressure doing to leaders? And then what is it going to take to recover and then lean sustainably, like David has said, over the long term? And so to help us do that, I'm really glad that we have Dr. Jemma King with us today. And so Jemma, my first question is, why do so many capable leaders miss the warning signs of stress and burnout in themselves?
I think leaders have had to work really hard to get to a certain place, and in that act, they've had to somewhat disassociate from the signals. You know, any grown-up parent in a busy job knows that, okay, right now I can't attend to these red flags, so I just have to keep going. Or they've just disassociated so much that they've got little insight into what they're feeling. And middle management is what I call sandwich stress. You've got pressure from below, pressure from above. Often your subordinates were your colleagues, so you're under a lot of scrutiny. And as David said, it's usually when you've got a baby or you've got, you know, a mortgage, a new mortgage. So, you know, this is a really, really stressful time for people. And people think, I've just got to get through this this period. And one of the things about burnout, one of the characteristics of it is a lack of control, a lack of agency and predictability. So, like, you know, you David was saying, if you're an executive, you kind of are sitting up on the balcony and you're like the DJ, you know, making people go left or right on the dance floor. Where when you're in the middle management, you're just getting washed along with whatever new initiative, what strategic goals have been thrown at you. And so that lack of agency and predictability is what makes you very, very stressed. I mean, we can put up with a lot of stress if it's ours and we impose it ourselves and we know how long it's going to take. It's very hard when you don't have that information. And so what we see when people get burnt out, first of all, it's just like extremely exhausted. So you sleep and you get up and you just still feel bone tired. It's like seeped into your very bone marrow. And then what happens, like I said, people feel detached or they get a sense of cynicism. Like nothing really feels fun or good, or you just have this really kind of negative disposition towards everything. You see negativity around you. You can't feel hopeful. You just feel like today is going to be, you know, just as bad as yesterday, and tomorrow is just going to be just as bad as today. So you don't really see that things are going to change. And then eventually your performance will drop. And if your brain doesn't stop you with some sort of mental health disruption, we typically see that your body does. And I know when people experience stress, we have this continuum of types of stress. So there's people who are emotionally expressive, you know that they are stressed because they express it. Then there's people who are more mentally orientated. They get scatty, forgetful. Their brains aren't working as well. And then we've got the somaticizers, or people who look seemingly like they're coping on the surface, but their stress will manifest physiologically. And we see this a lot in middle management. And so their brains are saying, we have to keep going. We have to keep going. I've got this, you know, amazing opportunity. And then their body will clap out. They will, you know, get sick all the time. Their sleep will typically suffer. So if you're wanting to sleep too much or not being able to sleep enough, even though you're exhausted, that is a really big signal of burnout. And so what we see is that when people actually do have a burnout situation, it feels terrible physically. It's disorientating. You feel like your body and your mind have betrayed you. You feel like you lose trust in yourself. And so I see this a lot with people who've gotten quite early in their career to a management position. They have a burnout situation. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. And then when they sort of get themselves together, or hopefully they do, and they get back to work and someone says, hey, how about you have this opportunity? Why don't you take on this extra work? Why don't you do this thing? People think, oh my God, that was horrific. I don't ever want to feel like that again. And people can actually shrink back and make themselves small. I see that a lot in females as well, because they're often carrying a lot of the load at home, the caring duties. They're running double shifts. And so it's a really awful situation to be in, where you have so much to give. You have so much, well, you thought you had so much possibility, but you just lose trust in yourself. And what's also terrible is maybe the people around you lose trust in the structural integrity of your ability. So someone says, why don't you give her or him that opportunity? And they go, didn't they have that burnout situation, last year? Maybe not, and they get passed over. So from my perspective, it's incredibly important to understand what is your first signals of stress. What is that thing that you start doing when you know the pressure's getting too high? Are you starting to procrastinate? Are you starting to get irritated by those around? Is everyone starting to annoy you? Is your sleep going? Are you becoming hypervigilant? Are you trying to get to, lots of control? Are you trying to get, like you said, bake yourself into everything because you feel stressed about it? Notice those signals, and I call it interoceptive ability. So attending to those red, flags waving in your face before they become a gaping chasm which you fall into. And that's clever, right? People think, oh, I don't have time to this, or like that's weak, or, that's, something for tomorrow. You're literally stealing from tomorrow to pay for today. And what we see is when people do get into that stress or burnout, the very skill sets that they need to be an efficient, effective, strategic leader become eroded. So that is your prefrontal cortex, your executive functioning, all your planning, being able to prioritize, being able to understand risk profiles. You get really badly distorted thinking. So everything becomes catastrophic. Everything becomes an immediate priority. You have the inability to regulate, but is that a must or is that a need? And then you get into that manic, I've got to do everything, and then you're trying to work really hard, and then it's just like a self-perpetuating cycle where you end up not doing anything very well.
Well, it's a great point. It leads me into my next question. What actually happens when leaders operate in a constant reactive mode?
So if you look from a physiological perspective, what is actually happening inside your brain and your body? So the human stress response system was designed to be adaptive for our ancestors who stood up, in the Africa 250,000 years ago. So the types of stresses that those guys would experience was usually mortal threat to their lives, getting chased by a saber-toothed tiger or a grizzly bear. And so our stress response system is highly adapted for that type of stress. So we'd get this cascading series of biochemical reactions like adrenaline and cortisol that would give us resources to fight or flee. Amazing, in those times it kept our ancestors alive. But in those days, hopefully you'd fight that bear, drag it into the cave and be having a nice tasty bear steak all snuggled up with a fire. You're safe, and then you could down-regulate, or the bear would get you, and either way, your stress would go down, right? And so it was designed to go up and then go down. But you think about our modern society and what leaders have to deal with. We've got, multiple technologies. We've got thousands of people. We've got dings in our face. We've got these little dopamine, phones in our, pushing dopamine to our skulls every day. This is unsustainable for our primitive stress response system. And so it will betray us in those most critical moments when we have to think deeply. And usually it's social stress, it's complex stress. We're looking at, taxation law. We're looking at, marketing strategies. We're looking at our competitors. These are very, very sort of sophisticated, complex operations that require multiple different facets of your brain operating at the same time. And when you're under primitive stress, or stress, where we think that this is really critical, our brains will shut off those parts of our executive functioning, and it'll send energy to our heart and lungs and our big muscle groups to fight or flee. This is a terrible disconnect between what's happening in our brains and bodies and what we need in these moments where we need an intelligent brain. And so we become reactive, and stress will house or shelve any non-essential activity in our brains and bodies that are not immediately for survival. So we see our digestion change. Your mouth will go dry just when you're about to public speak. You get a dysregulated gut. You don't, digest food in the same way. You actually suck out more calories out of food when you're stressed out, so it makes you put on weight. Your immune system will stop working efficiently. And so as I said before, this is not a sustainable profile for a leader, because what I've seen from my data, you can run in the red for about 8 weeks. And then after 8 weeks, something will snap, some circuit breaker. Will it be mental, be it physical, be it something, your relationship? I see 8 weeks is around the time where you can go on like hardcore red and then you can't.
So would you say they are then some of the early warning signs that a leader's pace is affecting them? Or what are those signs that, okay, this is, just a generally demanding period? Or no, I'm in an unsustainable pace that I can't maintain. And then I guess two-pronged question. And then how does that affect their team?
Well, this is it. This is the thing that often when we look at our data and when I look at work with leaders, they have very low insight into just how much their cognitive ability, their performance has been degraded under stress. They think they're firing maybe 80%, but they're actually firing at 50%. And this is the biggest thing. Like, people around them can see you're not okay. You're making stupid decisions, risky decisions. You become, cognitively myopic. You're not very cognitively flexible. These are all the consequences of stress, but you are totally unaware of it. And what we see is that people have different stress tolerances depending on a huge range of factors. So there's epigenetics, there's genetics, there's your intrauterine environment. So how stressed your mother was inside her belly. If she was very, very stressed, you've got lots of stress receptors in your brain. You can become quite dramatic or even seek stress unhealthily. Then we've got things like your life situation, your financial situation, how much social support you have, how much capacity you think you have, even things like moving house, your physical health, like do you have a chronic sickness? Do you have children who are sick? And then there's even more like day-to-day things, how much sleep you've had, how much sleep deprivation you're under. And then also things like how much blood glucose you have. If you have fluctuating blood glucose, we know it makes you highly emotionally reactive. And so when you think about, am I in the right state to make very big decisions right now? These are all the factors you should be looking at. And if any of those things are screaming red at you, think maybe I will delay this really important decision till I maybe have got my blood sugar under control. Maybe I've had a sleep. Maybe a day when I haven't had a massive fight with my kids or my partner, or maybe when, I haven't got a whole lot of other, seriously important decisions to make it work. So know thyself, really understand that your capacity to deal with stress, it fluctuates over time. And what hurts you doesn't make you stronger always. That's a myth. And so what you should do is have a very, I suppose, good, tight team of people who you rely on and that you can trust, who will say, hey, I think you're like, I don't know, not quite correct on this decision, or are you okay? You should be really looking for contributory dissent. So you should be really asking those around you, what are we missing here? What have I got this wrong? Poke holes in my rationale. Help me understand whether or not we're making the accurate decision, because we know that when you're stressed, you're more likely to make decisions quickly, 30% quicker, with incomplete information. And when you're stressed out, you tend to overestimate the positives of your decision, underestimate the negatives of your decision. And if new information comes in that's antithesis to what you've agreed on, you're 40% less likely to change your mind. So these are really good, important things to keep in mind when you feel like you're not doing so well.
And you mentioned sleep, and I think it's such an important topic for us to go into. It's obviously something that you're an expert in, and it's something that you and I have spoken about personally offline. What role does sleep and recovery, and to extend on what you've already spoken about, boundaries, play in sustainable leadership?
Yeah, so I actually forgot to answer the second part of your question about what does it mean for your team when you're stressed out, and then I'll go on to sleep. So what we know is we did a big study with McKinsey and Amy Edmondson from Harvard looking at psychological safety. And for those that don't know, psychological safety is literally just group trust. So it's when you have the confidence and you feel safe to speak up, voice things that you see as wrong, make, offer alternatives, ideas, and, be able to criticize each other without fear of reparation. And what we saw was we put the Whoop devices on nearly 200 leaders, and then we asked their subordinates, how much psychological safety or trust did you feel in the last meeting with your boss? Then we looked at the boss's data. We looked at how stressed they were, how sleep deprived they were, and we found a really, really interesting correlation, which we never thought we'd find. But we found that those leaders who were stressed and sleep deprived, the next day, their team members did not feel psychologically safe, and which was really interesting because often these subordinates had no idea what the boss was doing the night before, right? So there was obviously some kind of transmission of mood or attitude or something that just sort of squashed the subordinates' confidence in being able to speak up. And so if you're in person, we know that if a leader is stressed and sleep deprived, they will produce cortisol, and people in your vicinity, it's called chemo signaling. They can pick up these very minute volatile compounds that someone produces, and they catch it. We've got receptors on our skin and our paranasal sinuses that help us make inferences about the emotions of those around us. And subordinates are very, very good at picking up the feeling of what the boss has, because it behoves them to know, is the boss in a bad mood? Am I, in trouble or not? And so what we see is that if you are a boss, you're stressed out, you're sleep deprived, your team catches it. It's incredibly potent and very, very highly contagious, your mood and your state. It just kind of like drips down through your team. So you have a moral obligation not only to keep your emotions regulated, but because if you don't, your team will catch your emotions. We see it, more likely to come down from above. And what we find is that psychological safety gets crushed by a leader's sleep deprivation status. And we know that psychological safety is leader-led. And as Google found out, it is the most important singular factor for high-performing teams. They looked at 180 teams and they looked at all the data, what makes a high-performing team, and they brought it down to that one singular fact. Psychological safety is it, and if you don't have it, you literally cannot have a high-performing team. So it's really important for you to understand that your stress is contagious. And so what is the number one way to minimize stress? And as a stress researcher, I used to hate sleep. I thought it was so boring. And there's so many, as a leader, you've got so many things to read and do and think about and strategize. But as when I was looking at my data, I found something very, very pronounced, that there was not one person who I saw who had a mental health disruption, did not have a sleep disorder as well. And every single person who I saw who had a sleep disorder eventually succumbed to some form of mental health disruption. So there's a very, very strong correlation between sleep status and mental health. And so then I became very interested in studying sleep. And so I always say, if you want your biggest bang for buck, if you want to do anything, you want to change anything, go to bed before 10 o'clock and your whole life will change. It's like every really high performer that I've seen, they're very strict about their sleep. Unless you've got that DEC2 gene, there's some amazing people who've won the genetic lotto where you only have to sleep 4 to 5 hours a night and you are totally fine on foot, no physiological decrements. There's a lot of people who have this gene represented in politics and entrepreneurship, the generals, CEOs, because they can, do amazing stuff all night while all of us, gaunt monsters have to sleep. So yes, sleep is everything. If you feel unhinged, if you feel out of sorts, if you feel overwhelmed, if you feel like you're not coping, just go to bed.
Yeah, fantastic. And so we've looked at what burnout looks like from the inside, and Gemma's given us a really in-depth and unique description of what that physiologically is for us. But also we have to remember that we aren't the only ones creating this environment. Our organizations also play a part in creating those conditions, and strong performers are often those that we lean on the most. So we need to think about what happens when that becomes a pattern and that starts to work against both the individual and the team. And so, Kieran, I'd be interested, why do some organizations unintentionally promote burnout behaviors in their strongest performers?
I think about this probably from the analogy of there is somebody key in each team. So when I think about the finance department or the operations department, there's often a key go-to person, and often that person is really well known because they are the strongest performer in the team, or they're the person that has the most knowledge about how that area operates. And as a result, everybody coming to that person isn't necessarily thinking about all of the other people that are also going to the same person for whatever project, whatever challenge, whatever problem exists. And as a result, you end up with that one person who's well known for their performance because everyone knows to go to them. But as a result, that person becomes naturally overloaded potentially in their inflow of things going to them. And I think this ties into what David mentioned earlier around it's actually up to the person to manage the workload themselves. And other people won't be aware of all those other things on the go. And that person has a decision to make either in terms of how do they delegate or how do they pass off some of those other things to other capable people in the team or people that they know will be well able to step up to that challenge, or to push back and to say no sometimes, or to say, hey, we just need to come back to the priorities here, and are you across all these other things that I've got on my go, or through the person that they're working with to be able to manage that depending on how the organization operates.
Yeah, fantastic. And so what would you say the key uncomfortable truth would be for our ambitious leaders on the call that they need to hear about trying to do it all?
I think it comes back to what I said earlier, that what got you here, won't get you to your next role. Trying to do it all just shows like a lack of trust in the team that's around you. And ultimately, I think nobody wants to work for a leader who tries to do it all.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, to round the session, I am going to pose a final question to each of you. But before we do this, for everybody attending on the call, we do have some time left to do a small Q&A. So if you do have any questions for any of our panelists, please pop them in the Q&A chat. There should be a top bar somewhere for you to fill out and pop your questions in there. So to my panelists, and Kieran, I'm staring at you, so I'll ask you this first. Is there anything final that you'd like to share with the audience today, or something that you'd like our audience to leave with?
I think for me, it's probably three things. I think I often think about the pilot, right, when he's about to take off the plane and he's got his checklist and he's making sure they've done all those things. I think everyone needs to think about what is the checklist that they've got in order for what they want to achieve, and how do you make sure you're ticking that off regularly. I think, as we talked about earlier, being conscious with time is super important. And then I think for me, it's stop measuring yourself by what you do and start measuring yourself by what the team around you can do without you. And I think that's come through quite a bit over the last 90 minutes.
Yeah, brilliant. And Robert, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think the takeaways I'd highlight for people is really focusing on the long-term goals. Stepping up is okay for the situation if it needs it, but make sure you're doing it intentionally and you're doing it for a certain period of time, and it's strategically important. Don't really focus in on what the important and urgent the priorities are. Don't try and do everything.
Yeah, great. David?
I think it's understanding the discrete value you're going to add. So that transfer between middle management, upper middle management is recognising the purpose of the role that you're going into, why you're there and what success means in that higher role. And the second thing is trying to understand the horizon of work that you're currently investing effort in. So, that thing that's in front of you that you're working on, is it a today thing, a this week thing, this month, this quarter, this year? The more senior you get, the less day-to-day stuff you should be doing. So if you look at your calendar and you think someone else could do this or someone's better suited to do this, then lean into that and try and get it off your desk. And the second thing is this task something that's impacting the long-term success of the business, or is it just making my numbers look good for this week?
Yeah, great. Dr. King?
I have three things. Firstly, just know that leaders are now legally responsible for avoiding or making sure there's no psychosocial risks or hazards inside a workplace. So it is now becoming a you problem. And so be very aware of the emotional climate of your team, because there are legal consequences. Second, now with the advent of AI, being the smartest person in the room is not going to cut it. Being good at your skill is not going to cut it. Being a leader that people can come to, talk to, they feel trust, they feel warmth, they feel valued. All those human factors are going to become more important than ever. So you need to foster these, you need to train these, you need to get really good at it, because retaining good talent is going to become even more difficult when the barrier to going and starting your own thing is dropping with AI. And you can have an agent in your pocket that's got 10,000 times the IQ of the smartest person on the planet. So you need to be good at the human dynamic skills, emotional intelligence, and being engaging in self-leadership. And lastly, protect your sleep like your life depends on it, because it does. Sleep first.
So a couple of questions have come through. Any out of the four of you, it depends on who feels like that they've got a burning answer for it. One of our questions is, a lot of the sustainable leaders I've met seem to remain genuinely calm, even under peak pressure moments or crisis. Any tips on how to maintain that calmness in the moment and hold on to good quality decision making?
I'll jump in there. Practice hard things. The more you do it, the more calm you are when something stressful comes up, because you think, I've done this before, and you work out your stress strategies. Like, everyone has to work it out themselves. I call it stress inoculation. Is one of the most important factors to leadership. Do the hard things often, and they become not so hard, and then you look like that person who can withstand storms when everyone else is cowering. Be that person.
I think you don't get resilience, as Gemma said, you don't get it without doing it. So you want to be stronger, go to the gym. Same sort of analogy, right? Like expose yourself to these things. And as Dr. Gemma said, I would do it when the stakes aren't high, right? Don't step out on that limb when the future of your business is relying on it. So practice doing those things, expose yourself, make difficult calls, contribute to conversations you're uncomfortable with, trust people that you are not sure you should trust, because it goes both ways, right? It's your own capability to do things plus your ability to lead. So trust people, give them things to do that you're not sure they can do, right? That's giving you the resilience to be uncomfortable when the stakes don't matter, so that when the stakes do matter, you're not too uncomfortable.
Yeah, brilliant. And Kieran and Rob, this is actually probably a great question to the two of you. How do you confidently say no as a leader to others without feeling guilty, especially when you're trying to balance expectations and also protect your team's capacity, especially when you are used to saying yes as a high performer?
I think my initial kind of approach to these things is always kind of seek to understand first. So to try and get as much information around kind of what's going on. I think something that's come up a couple of times is this idea of being plugged into the long-term strategy and knowing kind of what's important and what actually makes a difference. So it's not a case of just deciding the next thing that comes up, you're going to say no to that one. It's probably more thinking about, hey, where does this sit kind of in the priorities? And then thinking about the alternatives is often an easy way to say no. So rather than saying, no, not never, not me, potentially saying, what about somebody else? Or not right now, can we get to that next month? Might be a different way of kind of approaching it.
I think Kieran's hit the nail on the head. I mean, business isn't a popularity contest. It's really about trying to understand why somebody is asking for something, why this is important to them, or why something else is more important than the thing they're asking for, and what the priorities of the organisation are. Taking the time to have the conversation with people is probably the key piece versus just trying to fire an email back at rapid pace. Take a breath.
Yeah, absolutely. And next question
on that, just thinking
please,
about an alternative as well, Rob, is that idea of, does it need to be 100% right, or is it like a gut feel response? Because sometimes someone can ask for something not realizing, there's 8 hours work to get that perfect, but they just want a gut feel, or they just want something quick. So there might be an alternative as well.
Absolutely. Because the number of times people will ask for something and not realising actually that's really difficult to do is happens all the time.
If people are looking for something, go Google or look up the monkeys and don't let other people's monkeys get on your back. And I think that'll help you too. Like, you're the reliable one. You've been the high performer. People have always come to you from answers. And then the risk is that you take them on board by default. So one of the things I used to do, which I'm not recommending everyone does, but I'll just tell you how I did it, is that I said, the time that I'm talking to you is the time I'm investing in this issue. So we're going to resolve it where we are right here, and I'm not taking any notes or actions. Now, you can't do that but as you get along, remember that if you're spending 15 minutes or half an hour talking to this person about this thing, that is the time. So try and resolve things in the moment with the best efforts. As Rob said, I don't have all the information, but if I had to choose now, well, you do have to choose now. So if you're 85%, then that's good enough, move on. Someone will catch that if it's a big problem. Trust your team. So that's what I do too, is that as I got very senior in very large projects, it was like, this moment is the moment that I'm going to add the value. So I'm not taking any actions away from it. Ask me the questions you need now. Bit of a hard ass approach, but I think that's helped me in my career.
Fantastic. Team, this has been a fantastic conversation, from the early lessons that shape how we lead through to the science of what chronic stress is doing to our bodies and our teams. There's some really clear themes that have come through. I think one of the biggest is that the shift from top performer to sustainable leader is one of the most significant transitions any of us will make. And it's clearly rarely straightforward. As we've heard today, it requires letting go of the identity that made you successful, building trust in the people around you, and being honest about the habits and behaviors that might actually hold you and your team back. So a reminder, we will be recording today's session. Please reach out if you would like a copy of the link. Our panelists, thank you so much for your generosity, your candor, your practical wisdom. To our leaders watching, thank you all for being here. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next session on the topic of leading people through constant change on the 28th of July.